You twins?
Nah, we cousins.
Growing up in the South, you hear cautionary tales of rattlesnakes hidden in the palmetto bushes, a time when blacks and whites shopped on opposite sides of the streets, and if you're like me, your grandmother would randomly break out into a humming spiritual tune while she was cooking, or right before she laid out a TED talk about the dangers of getting wrapped up into the worldly exploits of the streets and the devil's playground. This film touches on all of those nostalgic morsels, from the music, set design, to the awesome performances from a very talented cast. And we have to address some of the not so hidden symbolism within the film, and also the choice of historical nuances. Sinners is here, and I had to drop everything to go see it in the theater and join you all here to talk about it. I'd like to say thank you all for watching, and if you're new to Real Enigmas and Theories, welcome. Just so you know, this video will contain spoilers for the Sinners film. So without further ado, let's pull out those magnifying glasses and cook. Now, Sinners is a greatest mixture of From Dusk Till Dawn, the movie Life with Eddie Murphy and Martin Lawrence, Salem's Lot, and Brother Where Art Thou. You could add a couple more to this, but the film actually stands out on its own in my opinion. It's an instant classic. The film is about twin brothers Elijah and Elias Moore, infamously known as the Smokestack Twins, or Smoke and Stack, played by Michael B. Jordan. They pick up their cousin Sammy Moore, known as Preacher Boy, played by Miles Caton. The twins have returned to their hometown of Clarksdale, Mississippi to open up a juke joint after serving in World War I and working for Al Capone in Chicago before pulling off a heist that gave them enough booze, resources, and money to come back home and take advantage of the bootlegging industry. Their little cousin Sammy was the missing piece with his obvious musical abilities and his not so obvious ancestral inheritance of being a griot. The film starts off by giving us a bit of lore about griot. Griot, or griots, aren't just performers. They're custodians of ancestral memory. They remember the lineage of kings, the triumphs of ancestors, and the wisdom that's buried in time. Other cultures around the world had their versions of the same ancestral human libraries. In Ireland, they were called the Fili, and in Choctaw land, they were called firekeepers. This ability in the community is very sacred, and it can attract abundance, but it also can attract evil. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So, before the twins picked up their cousin, they met with the owner of a sawmill to purchase and use the spot for their juke joint. Hogwood had come late to their meeting, throwing the brothers' plans off to pick up their cousin and get everything ready to open up the juke that night. Smoke in the blue hat, Stack in the red hat. Smoke realizes that the floors in this dusty building are clean to the touch, and it piques his twins' eyebrows as well, to say the least. Hogwood takes the money and a caution from Smoke not to make any attempts to get any more money out of them or to enter their property or be met with full force. Hogwood offers the notion that the clan had been disbanded and the boys have nothing to worry about. I want to stop right here and bring a bit of historical context to what's going on around this time. After World War I ended in 1918, a wave of black soldiers returned home expecting greater opportunity and respect after fighting for America overseas. Instead, they faced brutal racism, job discrimination, and violent backlash, especially during the Red Summer of 1919, when race riots exploded across dozens of United States cities. Many black veterans were barred from getting steady work, blackballed from unions, and targeted by white supremacist groups. In this harsh environment, organized crime became a pragmatic route to survival for some of these black veterans. I mean, these guys had military training, they knew tactics, discipline, logistics, and how to use weapons as well. And these skills made them a very valuable asset in the crime underworld. In cities like Chicago, New York, Detroit, and New Orleans, some black soldiers started working as security for speakeasies, running bootleg operations, and acting as the muscle for number rackets, or they even managed the gambling dens themselves. The mafia and other ethnic crime syndicates, the Italians, Irish, and Jewish, saw these veterans as hard, smart, and trained, hiring them as enforcers, drivers, debt collectors, and even bodyguards. Sometimes they worked independently. Other times they operated under mafia families who needed tough, reliable men who they could pretty much underpay. While many black veterans weren't made men because of the race barriers, they weren't able to actually be in those families. They definitely played a critical frontline role in the day-to-day money-making operations of organized crime during the Prohibition era. Their involvement not only fueled the underground economy, but it also laid the foundation for independent black underworld empires to rise in the 1930s and 40s. And Smoke and Stack seem to be two brothers who were trying to capitalize off of all this motion going on in the industry. Now, on the other hand, October 15th, 1932 sat at a pivotal crossroads in American history, right at the heart of the Great Depression and those final throes of Prohibition. Franklin D. Roosevelt was aggressively campaigning against Herbert Hoover. He was promoting his vision of the New Deal while the nation reeled from record unemployment and financial collapse. Meanwhile, the streets were ruled by bootleggers and gangsters taking full advantage of Prohibition's chaos. Organized crime families were rapidly evolving, and with the dude like Al Capone in prison, new figures like Frank Nitti, Dutch Schultz, and Lucky Luciano were getting busy to solidify power. In fact, the groundwork for the mafia's infamous National Commission was quietly being laid during this period, forever altering the criminal underworld's business model. Beneath the surface, America was undergoing an invisible but unstoppable shift. From broken institutions to new experiments in government power, from gangster street wars to organized crime syndicates, and from the Prohibition era secrecy to a new, more openly lawless capitalism. I love that Coogler chose this time period for the film because it's one of the most pivotal moments in American history, a crossroads, if you will. Smoke and Stack were visionaries at a time when get in where you fit in was a make or break motto. So, Hogwood being late to that meeting made the twins have to call an audible by splitting up, with Smoke taking the truck with the equipment into town, securing the food, and getting some help from Bo and Grace Child, while pretty much letting it be known that the Smokestack twins were back in town, and they meant business. He hires a young girl off the street to watch his truck while he handles business with the Childs, and he gives her a lesson about negotiation, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. He shoots two guys trying to rob his truck in broad daylight. Meanwhile, Stack and Sammy go to find more music talent and put the word out about the grand opening at the local train station. That's where they find Delta Slim being played by Delroy Lindo. Sammy bumps into a young lady named Pearline who's admiring his guitar skills, and he invites her to the juke joint. Stack also runs into one of his old flames named Mary, who still loves him, and he obviously has a soft spot for her as well. Both women are married, by the way, sinners. Now, Smoke heads over to his old flame's house, Annie, who he shares the loss of a child with, and she happens to be a practitioner of hoodoo in the local community. Smoke pretty much pulls up on her to see if she'll do the cooking for the opening night. A few more characters were picked up on the way, and they all make it back to the sawmill and start converting it into their juke joint while it gets closer to sundown. Meanwhile, not too far away from the juke joint, a man with smoking burnt skin is running to a nearby house to ask for help. The man claims to be victims of Choctaw bandits, and the man and lady of the house answer the door with shotguns drawn. Their names are Bert and Joan. The couple allows the man to come in, but it turns out that that man is indeed a vampire running away from those Choctaw hunters, who no doubt are aware of what that man actually is and the dangers of the coming nightfall. So the Choctaw hunters leave before the sun sets, and the vampire Remick takes on the husband and wife to join his vampire legion. Now, up until this part of the film, there was no mention of vampires, and this is like 45 minutes in. From there, we see the Smokestack twins' newly purchased building go from an old sawmill to the bumpin' juke joint, and Remick and his two reborn recruits make their way to the juke joint to find Sammy after hearing him play and sing which is an exercise of his griot abilities. Now, Sammy was playing the guitar of one of his ancestors, who was the father of the Smokestack twins. Now, when the Smokestack twins were born, Stack was the second one, and he got stuck inside of his mother sideways. And Mary's mother actually helped her give birth to the twins, but the mother passed away during childbirth. Their father probably blamed Stack for the death of his wife, and he took it out on Stack through abuse and beating him throughout his childhood. He didn't really beat Smoke as much, but Smoke ended up killing the father to protect his brother. So both parents' lives were ended in connection with the twins. Stack with the mother during birth, and Smoke with the father protecting Stack. Sammy, having this connection to the guitar, coupled with his gift, played a tune that ended up being my favorite scene of the film. Sammy taps into his abilities on the stage in front of the entire juke joint and begins summoning spirits from the past and future. Sammy's gift, in the way it was depicted on the screen, along with the different musical undertones woven through time and culture, for me, this was the visual highlight of the film. It reminded me of that episode from the Wu-Tang American Saga on Hulu, when the RZA was sampling and he was able to summon the ancestor who actually turned him on to the records that he was sampling. In that scene, they were displaying the RZA's griot abilities, and like the film Sinners, they also used the firefly symbolism, which in West African cultures represents the messengers between the Orun, or spirit realm, and the Aye, or earth. Even in Choctaw culture, fireflies represent the embers of the ancestors believed to guide the travelers at night. And it was at this point of the movie where things really start heating up, because it was Sammy's gift that actually attracted Remick to the juke joint. I mean, they even used the firefly symbolism when the monsters got cornbread. The fireflies were all over the place. And it was such a sweet touch because the vampire's eyes glow, and they intertwined the fireflies with the vampire's eyes glowing in the background. I thought it was such a dope horror touch. It wasn't actually stated in the film, but Remick also appears to possess the gifts of the Philly, much like Sammy does. One thing I absolutely loved about this film was the usage of actual common vampire lore. I mean, you're staying true to the roots of the Deep South and the story of the sharecroppers and the historical aspect of it. Why not just stick to the plan with the vampire lore as well? When someone is turned, a transfer of memories and talent occurred that binds each person to Remick and turns his own memories and abilities within to the person that he actually turns. So much like common vampire lore, these vampires are actually a community in the mind as well as body. So pretty much Remick's motive becomes to obtain Sammy's gift and give Sammy his gift. And he states this close to the end of the movie. Remick actually tells Sammy this at some point. Remick also displays his abilities once he's gotten most of the people from the juke joint turned into vampires. He does this super dope rendition of the Rocky Road to Dublin, which is a song about the struggle of poor Irish folk making their way to Dublin, like a promised land of sorts. Now, let's take this time to examine something about the film that stood out to me heavily before the release of the film, and that's how they promoted it. Each of the character promo photos for the release stated, "We are all sinners," which made me immediately think of Catholicism. Catholics believe that we are indeed all sinners, even newborn babies, and we need God's grace for our entire lives. Slim even calls himself a sinner. Sammy rebels against his father and the church. Mary and Perline were both married women who committed adultery. Well, you get the picture. Near the end of the film, Remick catches Sammy and begins to perform an unholy baptism of sorts, and Sammy starts to recite the 23rd Psalm, and Remick joins him, stating that he remembers these very words being forced on his people by men who invaded their lands. Now, this is where the Catholicism actually comes in. Catholicism hit Ireland hard around the 5th century, mainly through missionaries like St. Patrick, who himself was actually a British Roman. Now, if Remick remembers this, He was alive around that time. Either that or he has the memories of whoever turned him into a vampire that may have experienced this. Who knows? I don't know. But for hundreds of years, the British Empire suppressed Irish Catholics violently. No voting rights, no property ownership, no education in Catholic schools. This oppression locked Catholicism into the Irish identity. And after events like Cromwell's conquest of Ireland, tens of thousands of Irish men, women, and children were captured, sold, and shipped to colonies, especially Barbados, Jamaica, and the colony of Virginia here in the U.S. Many were literally called white slaves and advertised in newspapers, auctioned off, beaten, essayed, and pretty much worked to death. Their treatment was just as brutal as African slaves. However, their time was temporary as indentured servants, but indigenous American and African slaves' time was permanent, and you could become a slave through inheritance. A lot of people don't know this, but the first slaves in America were actually white and many were Irish. But just to be clear, there's a distinct difference in chattel slavery and indentured servitude. In 1847, during the Great Irish Famine, the Choctaw Nation, who themselves had recently survived the brutal Trail of Tears, raised and sent about $170 to help the starving Irish people. Now, on the Spotify page for the Sinner's soundtrack, a newspaper article dated in 1911 alludes to Remick's arrival to America. You can go check that out. When he was being chased by those Choctaw hunters, he said that they had killed his wife. And at first, I took this as a ploy for sympathy from Bert and Joan, but the fact that Remick was actually being chased by Choctaw and Bert indicating that there are no Indians in that area, given the history between the Irish and the Choctaw, makes me wonder if he did indeed have a female with him. And he possibly actually went out to seek the Choctaw, knowing the history behind them. But then when he got there, they realized what he was and they turned on him. Because Bert says that there are no Indians in that area, and the Choctaw definitely wanted to hightail it up out of there as the sun was going down. So, did those Choctaw hunters really kill his wife? The film also dives into the relationship with Chinese Americans in the South. The meeting with Smoke and the Childs display the complex positioning of the Chinese Americans in the Jim Crow South. After the Civil War, Black Americans began carving out their own economic strongholds with towns like Mound Bayou. Smoke actually references this community when talking to Sammy about giving up his own juke joint dreams, and he suggested for Sammy to go down to Mound Bayou. Places like Rosewood, Tulsa, Greenwood, and even parts of Harlem where Black farmers, doctors, bankers, and business owners thrived independently. But white elites, fearing the rise of wealth in the Black community, devised a buffer system. Chinese immigrants, fresh from the railroad labor and barred from the white neighborhoods, were steered, sometimes legally and sometimes economically, into the Black communities. Secretly backed by white-owned banks and supply chains, these Chinese-owned businesses became the front lines of resource extraction through grocery stores, laundromats, restaurants, and liquor stores that captured the Black dollars and funneled profits out of the community where they would never be reinvested. The trick was Black entrepreneurs were systematically blocked from competing through racist lending policies, city zoning, and outright intimidation. Chinese shop owners, while themselves marginalized by whiteness, were granted enough foothold to operate above Black communities but still beneath the white economic institutions. They were allowed to open up stores but rarely owned the land. Their capital, the banking, the legal protections flowed through the white networks. Meanwhile, Black residents had no real local ownership of their own. No supply chains, no food sources, or even basic service. They were trapped in a constant consumer role, steadily bleeding out the wealth with every dollar spent. And a lot of that still goes on to this day. By the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement was a critical blow. The struggle against segregation was righteous, but integration had a devastating economic consequence. When Black customers could finally shop at white department stores, attend white schools, and work at white-collar jobs outside of their own communities, Black towns and Black-owned businesses were abandoned at scale. Young talent, doctors, teachers, lawyers left for white cities, and the Black dollars now funded white economies directly instead of circulating a few times inside the Black neighborhoods. Civil rights victories may have opened doors socially, but it closed the door economically on the fragile independence of Black communities, and they had to fight to reconstruct that, which never really happened. This is what literally ended communities like Mound Bayou. In the end, the two-step maneuver was complete. First, use the Chinese and other non-Black immigrants to drain the growing Black economy under the Jim Crow. Then, once Black communities were weakened, finish the job with integration, siphoning the last drops of economic power into the white mainstream society. The tragedy is not that Black Americans sought freedom. The tragedy is that the form of freedom they were offered was the one that dismantled their own systems of ownership, entrepreneurship, self-sufficiency, while leaving them more economically vulnerable than ever. In other words, shit was better before the civil rights movement. The funny thing about this film touching on this is that Remick was actually trying to warn the brothers of this very thing. I noticed that Remick and Mary were very concerned after Annie was bitten, and Smoke kept his promise to end her before she turned. Remick's main target was Sammy. However, he also wanted to obtain the memories and abilities of the hoodoo practitioner, but Smoke kept his word and ended Annie before that could happen. When you saw Annie shaking the bones on the gambling table, she had foreseen her future demise and didn't want her knowledge being used by Remick. Moreover, getting Annie into the fold would be a huge advantage in persuading Smoke to join, who would be another huge asset with Smoke's tactical skills alongside his newly vampire brother, keeping the pillars of Joaquin and Boaz intact. Getting the twins, Annie and Sammy, would surely seal the deal. And speaking of deals, Remick carried 2 gold coins with him and only offered them to the whites in the film. At first, the house of Bert and Joan, and then again outside the juke joint with Mary. Smoke and Stack also carried 2 silver coins with them. Call me crazy, but almost every time we saw the coins, they were in like a Vesica Pisces symbol. In ancient times, coins were used symbolically and ritualistically to represent a deal, a pact, or a contract. In ancient Greece, coins were placed in the mouths of the dead to pay the ferryman for passage across the river Styx. This was a spiritual deal, a coin for passage. In Rome, coins were buried or offered in deals to God's favor, victory, or prosperity. In China, ancient cash coins were not only traded, but used for spiritual deals, rituals, protections, and offerings to the ancestors. Even in West Africa, cowrie shells often acted like coins, and they were used in consulting the spirits about a deal or a decision. And we see many deals being made on the film. Sammy even notes to his father about how he's worked all week and him going out to play music is the trade for his hard work. Stack negotiates with Delta Slim about his compensation for opening night. Smoke enlightens the young girl outside about negotiating her time and watching the truck. He also negotiates the prices with Lisa Child, and Smoke even makes a deal with his brother to let Sammy live out his life. Hell, even Hogwood tries to negotiate before Smoke unloads the clip on him. And as the old saying goes, you don't get what you're worth, you get what you negotiate. There's so much we could continue to discuss, like the choice of names for several characters, namely Elijah and Elias, which are 2 versions of the same name. Something else I noticed at the church was that the choice to invert the triangle above the door. I can't really show you here because I don't have like any 4K visuals of it. But one moment the triangle was pointing up to the roof, And then inside the church, it changes. We could talk about the vultures that seem to show up everywhere and circle above as if they knew something were about to go down. We could talk about the Masonic symbolism with the songs about traveling, the twins being Joaquin and Boaz, Mary with the checkered pattern matching Sammy's poster in the background, even cornbread being the Tyler at the door. We could talk about Stack coming in the room with that Biggie style Coogee sweater on and the 4-finger stack ring, Sammy living on to open up a club and name it Pearline, but we'll save some of this stuff for the conversation in the comment section. Anyway, let's give Ryan Coogler, Michael B. Jordan, and this entire cast and crew their flowers. This film is an instant classic and a masterpiece. The cinematography, lighting, sound design, score, acting, symbolism, the storytelling, and the editing, all of that shit is top tier. The cinema experience itself watching on IMAX made it feel like you were right there in the juke joint at some times. The creativity and folklore behind this film sets it apart from any other project set in this time period. Hands down. I give this joint a 10 out of 10.
Grand opening, grand closing.
Grand opening, grand closing.
Hey yo, just because Smoke and Stack are running bootleg hooch down to Clarksville doesn't mean you should be watching the bootleg version of the film. So Lindy, hop your ass right on down to the theater and support the film. In my first Sinners video, I left a few things out, seeking to spark the conversation in the comment section, but there's so much in this film to speak about. Notice in my first video, I didn't refer to Sinners as a movie one time. I referred to it as a film intentionally because we use the word movie in everyday conversation regardless of the quality and time put into the project. Using the term film for me isn't just a nod to the fact that Coogler actually chose to use film, but it also is a respect to his approach to the actual art form of filmmaking. This evening, we're going to talk about some of the notions at the end of my first video, reveal some of the amazing placement of ritual theater, hoodoo being everywhere in the film, and some esoteric moonshine sprinkled throughout a deeper meaning. Heavy gratitude to you all for watching, and if you're new to Real Enigmas and Theories, welcome. This video will contain spoilers for the film Sinners, so consider this a heads up. So let's pull out those magnifying glasses and cook. At the beginning, we see Sammy, and the film starts on Sunday morning, the day after everything that happened at the juke joint on Saturday, or Sabado, or Sabbath. We see a man on a wagon with a horse, and the horse seems to react to Sammy's presence. This happens later on with Smoke as well, and there's a hidden connection there that we'll pick up on later. We can see the fresh cuts on his left cheek from Remick. We see flashes of Remick as both of his parents speak to him, but mostly his father, Jedediah. Here's where we also learn the name of Sammy's mother, Ruth. We're going to talk about Ruth and Jedediah later on in the video. Their names are very important to some other connections we'll discuss later. Now, I addressed the notion of deals, bargains, and pacts spread throughout the film in my first video. Smoke teaches the young girl how to negotiate. Stack negotiates with Delta Slim. Smoke makes a deal with his twin for Sammy's chance of living his life out. And there are a bunch of other deals and pacts that are made throughout the film. But here we have a preacher proposing a pact to his son. He asks Sammy to swear in front of his congregation that he would leave those sinning ways where they lie. He didn't say where they lay, but he said where they lie. And earlier, Sammy can be seen using the lye soap when his mother was washing clothes. Lye is also used in hoodoo rituals. Lye soap was used to wash away spiritual filth, not just dirt, but curses, bad luck, hexes, and ward off enemies. People would wash their hands, bodies, or even their floors and doorways with homemade lye soap as a ritual for spiritual purification. In some cases, it was combined with herbs like hyssop, blessed salt, or Florida water to amplify the cleansing effect. And the movie made a point to show this, and we also hear Sammy's mother saying that the lye soap would dry you out. Another hoodoo practice I noticed was Sammy keeping his intentions and tools of his expression under his bed. Some people call this bed working. Sammy feels under his bed for his guitar, which his father had taken to the church as a bargaining tool. He tells Sammy, "Yeah, I brought it in here, but I'm trying to get you to help me do my sermon for tomorrow." And that's when he has him read a passage from Corinthians. He sets the guitar by the communion table that says, "In remembrance of me," which is a reference to the Eucharist. Then we see the father trying to make a pact with Sammy with his congregation dressed in all white, which is also a nod to Ifa, voodoo, Haitian voodoo, and others. The way they threw these African spiritual systems in there was stellar. Sammy took notice that his father was offering something similar to what Remick had to offer. And this is why we see the flashes of Remick mirroring Sammy's parents as they spoke. Sammy's father had his congregation, and Remick had made his congregation out of the people that went to the juke joint. Ruth takes notice to the cuts on Sammy's face that we later see left prominent scars that were even displayed on the artwork at his club. I think this may be a nod to ancient African scarification rituals of tribal markings. Now, these tribal markings have multiple purposes and reasons depending on where and when you're from. Marks often identify tribe, clan, or family affiliation, like a passport in traditional societies. Scarification ceremonies may signify adulthood, warrior status, or marriage readiness. They also have a spiritual and protective meaning. These marks can be protective charms invoking ancestral spirits or deities. And some scars even act as a medicine believed to carry healing or magical properties. We saw some of this same scarification symbolism with Jordan and Coogler in Black Panther as well with Killmonger. In many African cosmologies, the skin is not just flesh. It's a spiritual console between the seen and unseen worlds. And scarification turns the body into a kind of spiritual armor. The scars placed on the temples, forehead, or cheeks were believed to guard against evil spirits or malevolent forces. In regions like the Yoruba kingdoms, certain patterns correspond to Orisha worship, like Ogun for war or Ishu for crossroads and communication. A healer might slice a small incision at the specific energy point, like the area of the third eye or the jawline, and then rub powdered roots, ash, dry herbs to gain strength, fertility, or even healing. Now, like I said, in many of these practices, the body is more than just flesh. It's actually a living altar. And spirits like Loa can ride or possess a person, turning their body into a channel for divine energy. Veves are sacred drawings used to invoke specific Loa. They're drawn in either flour or ash on the ground, but the concept of sacred geometry as a gateway for spirits is ancient. And this scarification, in a sense, is a permanent veve on the skin. Specific shapes, patterns, and placements acted as sigils to call or repel spirits. In the Americas, enslaved Africans hid this tradition in plain sight, substituting scarification with ritual tattoos, charms carved into bones, leather, or fabrics. And most of them wore gree-gree pouches, better known as mojo bags. In hoodoo, they have a practice called cut and blow spells, and it involves cutting the skin and rubbing in powders or herbs. And this powder directly descends from the scarification herbal infusion practices from West Africa. Now, even when we look at the scars on Sammy, they actually seem to have protected him at some point. Think about it like this. How did he drive right past the clan who was coming down the same road that he was driving up? Very much like how the gree-gree pouch or mojo bag protected smoke. Not only that, scars and mojo bags are two sides of the same spiritual technology. One is actually worn within the skin. The other is carried close to the body, but both of them function as portable power sources rooted in African spiritual systems. Scarification was a way to embed spiritual energy into the body, just like the mojo bags carried spiritual energy in a pouch. The scar becomes the seal or the container of intention. Herbs, ash, animal parts, or ritual powders were often rubbed into the wounds, literally loading the body up with some magic. Mojo bags are also loaded with the same items and were created and practiced for the same desired outcome of protection. And once they're created, they're charged up the same way. They require words of power like prayers and chants, offerings like oils and ash, along with herbs. So during slavery in the Americas, it became too dangerous or impractical to continue visible scarification. So African descendants migrated the magic outward to the mojo bag. It was discreet, portable, and less likely to draw attention. But the core idea stayed the same. It's a personalized charm loaded with the spirit energy to protect, attract, or empower. And remember when I told you about the horse reacting to Sammy's presence with those scars on his face? We know that Smoke walks around with the mojo bag on. And when he was walking between the child's stores on the street, one of the horses can be seen reacting him in a similar manner. Now, Annie is definitely one of the real heroes of sinners. Annie's knowledge and information definitely helped them in that situation. Even though very few of them made it out, her knowing what they were dealing with was pivotal. To me, Annie was the song of Hank Blue and the blues. And her blues were the sadness and her determination to protect her community. I mean, when we first met her, she was selling something to the little girl to take back to one of her elders. And it was her mojo bag that repelled Stack from biting Smoke. And when he took it off, he got hit in the abdomen with that bullet from the Klan. But I gotta keep it a beanbag with you. That plantation money was the only shit that I couldn't personally get down with myself. Yeah, I wasn't with her on that one. I had to agree with Smoke when it came to the money. That plantation money bullshit was the true blood money. And Annie acted like she was too good for Smoke's so-called blood money. But that plantation money, along with the Chow family working directly with the plantation owners to draw non-legal tender based off the backs of tenant farmers, yeah, I couldn't rock with it. I mean, Grace Chow was the one who actually called the vampires into the place. The Chow family was working directly with the plantations to usurp all of the money and the labor from the community. There's no way around that. And those same Chinese Americans would ostracize those of their own race who mixed with black people that they lived around and serviced for many years.
Blacks in the South have such a low social status that you simply can't be seen in public with them and still expect to have any respect.
Time to help them try to go to barber shop. That's how the American barber know he not the full-blood Chinese. They say don't cut no in the hair. They put that way.
Civil rights movement helped the Chinese to attain certain status among the white world, more or less. Whereas we didn't have anything gained in the black world because they didn't have nothing for us to step into.
See, my people, they think that blacks shouldn't belong with Chinese people. My people want me to marry someone of my own color so that, we'll have our own color because of the blood. You shouldn't mix the blood up. I don't have anything against you. I don't have anything against any color. And I was raised around black people. I'm not going to turn against black people because my people told me not to. I have my own life to live.
We're considered colored, but considered Chinese because we're only half Chinese. My father met my mother. It was right after the slaves was emancipated in the South.
I don't think that they will marry black, my children. Personally, I think that Chinese people tend to, you put me on the spot.
Now, there's a difference between freemen and freedmen, but that's a whole nother video. The freedmen with the D were those who, after slavery, went through an indoctrination system held by the Freedmen's Bureau that taught folks how to assimilate into society and move closer to sharecropping. and they were taught to accept these private notes called plantation script. Smoke said to her that she couldn't spend it anywhere, and she said that she was staying right there anyway, and that is the very point of the plantation money. The Chows were the store that really accepted the real blood money, and they were in bed with the plantations to make good on the scripts received from the sharecroppers. I mean, you could see the box for the scripts right next to the cash register.
Guilty as charged.
The U.S. government didn't outlaw most private currency systems until after the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which actually enforced wage protections. Even though slavery was abolished, plantation scripts kept black families economically chained to those plantations for generations. The system was totally rigged. The owners set the prices, issued the money, they ran the stores through the Chinese, and they tallied all the debts. I mean, just imagine working for Walmart and then they pay you with a Walmart gift card. I spoke more about the positioning of the Chinese in my first video. You can go check that out. Like I said, Annie was a pivotal character, and as I pointed out before, there was hoodoo symbology before she even shows up. Even when Smoke walks away from the young girl watching the truck, the song Wang Dang Doodle increases in volume and the name Caroline Dye is mentioned. In fact, the entire production is a beautiful, well-crafted cinema ritual. I have seen so much negative press about the film being demonic and that you should be careful or either steer away from it. And to this I say, to each his own. But I also feel like this is exactly the overtone expression of the film, and that's the demonization and erasure of African spiritual traditions. I believe that Sammy's father knew his son had a gift and wanted him to abandon his gift. Delroy Lindo's character, Delta Slim, enlightened the young preacher boy about the blues coming over to America from Africa. Now, before we continue, I want to be clear that not all copper-colored people in America are from Africa directly. Some are indigenous to this land, and that includes the Choctaw. So when Bert called them fair-skinned ninjas, I just had to laugh at that. Not only the Choctaw, but many tribes across the land, period. The fact of the matter is that many Africans were indeed brought to this land and enslaved along with many indigenous tribes. And other Europeans were also at war physically and spiritually with Europeans. And the proof of this is that African customs that were practiced and mingled in with indigenous herbal knowledge was passed down through generation from generation and holistically accepted in the communities. Christian teachings were actually practiced alongside the ancient wisdom here in America and were very popular, while the practitioners were well respected and some of them were actually feared. While white Southern elites publicly condemned hoodoo as devil worship or ignorant superstition, many of them were quietly sneaking out at night to visit the very root workers who they demonized. These conjure doctors were libraries of ancestral knowledge, herbal medicine, and spiritual insight. They also treated ailments that the conventional doctors couldn't or wouldn't even address. They blended plant science, intuition, and ritual to get their results. But to maintain their public image and hold up their racist social order, these elites vilified and demonized hoodoo in the courts, the pulpits, and in the newspapers, while privately relying on it for personal healing, fertility issues, legal victories, and curses against their rivals. Now, to deepen their control over black spiritual life, white elites strategically turned the rising of black churches against root-working traditions. They funded and influenced Christian pastors to make sermons that painted conjure doctors as ungodly and dangerous. And this drove a spiritual wedge within the black community, pushing folk medicine underground and rebranding it as shameful. Back in the day, the conjure woman and the preacher coexisted as pillars of the same community. But then Christianity was sanitized and approved, and ancestral healing was criminalized and cast away. It wasn't about just religion. It was about silencing that independent power. But the story doesn't end with condemnation. white entrepreneurs saw the power and profitability of the conjure doctor's practice, a local specialist with loyal clientele, known for effective remedies and word-of-mouth success, and you know they had to jump on that. They stole the business model wholesale and created snake oil salesmen, white men who toured the South mimicking spiritual healers, selling fake cure medicines filled with alcohol, opium, ether, and a bunch of lies. And they got rich off of those fake elixirs while conjure doctors were being arrested and run out of town. These grifters became the prototype for what would eventually evolve into the American pharmaceutical industry that we see today. As medicine was industrialized, conjure doctors were erased from legitimacy totally. Yet, ironically, modern pharmaceutical companies built their systems on the same model. Most of the medical system had doctors that would make house calls and go from house to house, but they bit the whole style of the conjure doctor, who had people come to the healer's place, pay for the mysticism, and receive treatment without explanation. The difference is now the healers wear white coats instead of head wraps, and the medicines are patented instead of prayed over. Once the white establishment had extracted the essence of the root workers model, they repackaged it for their own poor and working class communities through circuses and traveling medicine shows along with county fairs. These became theatrical events where the snake oil salesman wasn't just a healer, he was an entertainer, a preacher, and a magician. They mimicked the exact charisma of the conjure doctor, dressing flamboyantly, speaking in coded language, and presenting their cures with a ritual-like performance. But instead of sacred roots and ancestral spirits, they used colored liquids, fake testimonies, liars from the crowd who claimed to be healed, and a whole bunch of other stuff. You know, they had to make it look good. The same mystery that gave black root work its power was now being peddled as a spectacle to white audience that were desperate for hope and healing. The crazy part is these events controlled an outlet for belief and desperation. The elite had learned from root workers, then commodified their style to exploit their own lower class, turning healing into a hustle. And this led to what we see people today still following the trend of demonizing something that you don't understand. And I'm going to tell you like this. I know my grandma was an herbal healer, and so was her mother, and so was her mother, and so on and so forth. And her spiritual knowledge has always served as a roadmap for me. And it's obvious to me that separating us from that was one of the tricks that made many forget about traditions from their homeland, and many forget that this was their land. Very much like the positioning of other immigrant races setting up shop in the black communities to take and strip that away from them. Kugler's choice to show us that relationship was a bold statement that not only sparks a healthy dialogue, but can lead us to tools to fix a problem that still exists today. And like I said, let's make sure that Center's final week at the theaters is its biggest week ever. It's bigger than the opening week. The film already made history with only a 6% drop in attendance from the first to second weekend. And even if you don't like some things about this film, you can't negate the fact that the dialogue opportunities are definitely there. I mean, time period films always have a way of making us examine history and compare it to now, but Center takes this deeper expression to a whole nother level. Last video, I mentioned some of the Masonic symbolism, but I think it's only right to point out some of the connecting threads in this video. Cornbread was the Tyler who left his station and acknowledged the evil presence that knew him by name. The Tyler is stationed outside the closed doors of the lodge and is usually armed with a sword. He checks the credentials of the visitors who wish to enter, ensuring that they are in good standing, have the necessary signs, tokens, and passwords. He represents the spiritual and intellectual guarding and the ideal of protecting sacred knowledge from profane eyes. And his name was clearly acquired by Remick turning Mary. And this is why there was a point made to show that Mary knew Cornbread. I thought it was pretty cool that Cornbread's wife was named Therese, which means to harvest. And that's exactly what we saw her doing out there. Pearline done burned up out there with all the other vampires. I know her husband at home sitting there like, where the hell she went? But it's all good though, because if he would have seen how she was carrying on at the juke joint, I mean, yo, Pearline was for the streets. Imagine you sitting at home after work and your wife is down at the juke joint doing this. Nah, let's get back to the Masonic symbolism. We see in the Bible, you have Ruth, who was the name of Sammy's mother, was the outsider who becomes an insider. She was a Moabite widow who chose loyalty over convenience, and she followed Naomi back to Bethlehem. There she marries Boaz, a wealthy man, and then they have a son named Obed, who becomes the grandfather of King David. Then King David has a son, and his name is Solomon, who God names Jedediah. So there we have Ruth and Jedediah. And this makes Ruth the great-great-grandmother of Solomon, who would later build the first temple of Jerusalem, which is the cornerstone of the Masonic legend and symbolism. Now, you have Jedediah, better known as Solomon, who is the master builder that commissioned the temple of Jerusalem and placed the pillars Joachim and Boaz right in the front. And Boaz was named after Ruth's husband. This means that Solomon literally built the temple with his ancestor's name carved into the entrance. See, even people in the Bible pay respects to their ancestors. Just think about it like this. When a Mason passes through the twin pillars, Joachim and Boaz, they walk through a living legacy of Ruth and Jedediah. In many esoteric and Masonic systems, the twin pillars, Joachim and Boaz, are symbolically represented by the colors red and blue, just like the smokestack twins. Here's another fun fact about the name Ruth. It's also the yellow point star in the Eastern Star teachings, which is also Masonic. Did you catch that FUBU reference? Now, in discussions about this with people who've seen the film, I've heard the notion that Remick symbolizes white predatory nature in the music industry when it comes to blues and Sammy. However, I see it a bit different because Remick never had a chance to absorb Sammy's talents. And Sammy actually went on to live his life and join the music industry that exploited the talents of many musicians of all cultures. And how do we know? Because they made a point to show Sammy had actually released music and changed his style to fit the music industry's sensationalism. Stack even tells Sammy that he didn't like his music as much as he liked his original style. I think that the actual vampire metaphor lies within the predatory system of the plantation scripts and the positioning of the Child family with its relationship to the so-called Black community. So there's my follow-up into the ritualistic storytelling, spiritual symbolism, and the cultural layers that make Sinners more than just a film. Coogler's use of actual film is more than just a nod to the craft. And hoodoo and ancestral magic aren't just background music flavor. I mean, everything from the lye soap to the positioning of the guitar under the bed reflects Western African traditions disguised in Southern daily life. I thought that was brilliant. Annie was one of the true heroes of this story. She was the carrier of ancient hidden knowledge and the embodiment of the blues as a spiritual language. And the Child family, their complicity in the Black economic enslavement frames the real vampirism not as a spiritual bloodsucking, but a systematic financial theft. So there you have it. More symbolism and a different look at who the vampires that were walking around in the daylight were. They were able to pass between the literal and proverbial streets. And I love how we got a chance to take a brief look at how the film displays a complex history of hoodoo. This one's for all the grandmothers who said prayers to keep us safe from the streets to the suburbs and back to the curbs. The same grandmothers who could break a fever with her whisper, some pot liquor and herbs. And to the grandfathers who broke down the knowledge and wisdom with words, but gave us an example of providing and protection while leaving their blood, sweat, and tears soaked in every square inch of the earth. Good evening. This is part 3 of my exploration of the film Sinners and the topics and symbolic nature of the project. Thank you to all for watching. And if you're new to Real Enigmas and Theories, welcome. This video will contain spoilers for the film Sinners and maybe some comparisons for others. This is one you should pull out your magnifying glasses for sure. Let's cook. Over thousands of years in time and thousands of miles on the earth during human history, powerful cultures have stolen and monetized customs from other cultures. We see this same blueprint repeat itself in today's music industry, especially within rap. Artists bite flows and ad-libs without paying homage and leaving the game saturated with copycat voices with no authenticity. And I'm gonna keep it a beanbag with you. Even content creators on platforms like YouTube or TikTok bite styles and copy vibes and thumbnail styles, and that also leads to a lack of authenticity, chasing clicks and views rather than striving for meaningful impact. Instead of learning from each other and being inspired by one another, humans have stunted their own growth with jealousy, hatred, and envy. The film Sinners touches on this in various ways, but in this installment, we're going to focus on just one. I've mentioned it briefly in parts 1 and 2, but some of the dialogue in the comments section and the misconception of some of the notions that I set forth should be made a little bit more clear. I'll start off by saying that the death of Annie in the film represents her rebellion against the perceived evil getting its hands on her knowledge and wisdom that was passed down from her grandmother. My other interpretation of her death is the stomping out of natural healing and protection information in the soul of the community. In my part 2 video, I stated how natural healers and root workers were systematically demonized yet secretly mimicked by white entrepreneurs in snake oil shows. They flipped it and bounced it and repackaged it with stimulants and drugs, then sold it back to society without acknowledging the original source. And that led to the pharmaceutical industry that we see today. Now, some viewers in the comments took those words as a reference to modern medicine, although I never stated the words modern medicine. Modern medicine is rooted in diagnostics, research, clinical study, and surgeries. I mentioned the pharmaceutical industry, which is something totally different. They are intertwined, but they're totally different. Big Pharma is a for-profit industry that develops, manufactures, and markets drugs. It's driven by shareholders, patents, profit margins, and not actually healing people. While it does produce life-saving medications, it also heavily lobbies government, inflates drug prices, and hides unfavorable research. I mean, prescriptions over cures, right? Now, when I stated that hoodoo became an amalgamation of rituals and remedies from African, indigenous, Caribbean, and multiple spiritual backgrounds of the same regions, that's correct. And during the time period of the Sinners film, the average mountebanks or snake oil salesman had evolved into very large companies that had stolen knowledge about plants, elixirs meant for healing, like Upjohn. We literally see Annie selling the little girl some Upjohn for that plantation money. Upjohn is now owned by Pfizer, by the way. Notice how the same products that Annie was selling from the shelves in her home can be seen in the child's town shop as well. Annie was entangled in the same financial trap set by the plantation owners who controlled the supply chain coming from the snake oil companies and selling watered down versions of what the elders showed them in secret. However, before they evolved, they traveled on stagecoaches to poor white communities with bogus cure-all tonics and procedures that not only made them extremely wealthy, but for the time, it created a need for consumer protection laws because people were ending up hooked on opium, ether, they were being maimed by botched procedures or even deceased. These snake oil salesmen paid off politicians, educational organizations, and black churches to demonize natural healing. Hoodoo and root working were crackery and witchcraft. This led to the passing of laws that incarcerated those who continued to practice their American right of freedom of religion. They aligned themselves with Masonic organizations that not only had governmental influence, but controlled every aspect of entertainment, namely the circus. snake oil presentations called medicine shows made their way into more towns by way of the circus, all while pushing out the root workers, shamans, and natural healers. They stole that style of mysticism and flamboyant presentation and turned it into a performance. And these high-powered companies still remain as most of the pharmaceutical companies that we see today. And I'm going to prove it in this video. When smoke rides into town, you can hear the song Wang Dang Doodle by Howlin' Wolf playing. The song mentions Carolyn Dye, who was actually arrested for practicing healing in her community. The Sinners film takes place in 1932. A good 12 years after a paper that was written, it reconstructed the American medical education system. Companies like the Rockefeller Standard Oil Empire, which had major financial ties to the pharmaceutical companies, backed the Flexner Report of 1910. This report, funded by the Carnegie Foundation with the Rockefellers' blessings, called for the closure of hundreds of medical schools, including nearly all Black, women-led, and homeopathic schools. Natural and herbal healing, midwifery, and root work-based practices were labeled unscientific, and formal medicine became a closed club for white male, Western-trained physicians only. I have to add in here that America has come a long way from its dirty history that we once had. And as a nation, we still have work to do, but we have to be mindful about not backsliding into turmoil and use these topics to continue on a path of enrichment for everybody that's willing to work for it. Anyway, in the film, I believe that the loss of Smoke and Annie's child was symbolic of the stamping out of midwifery. This type of loss scenario was used to scare the public away from natural midwifery. Smoke even questions why Annie's hoodoo couldn't save their child. And I have to say that subliminal right there was real heavy when I thought about it. I went to see the film again for a fourth time, and being reunited with their child at the end made that notion even more clear to me. That's what they were talking about. Once companies like Bayer, Merck, and Eli Lilly established their chemical labs, they lobbied Congress and state governments to pass laws that made it illegal to prescribe, sell, or practice medicine without a license. This included root workers, midwives, and hoodoo practitioners. At the same time, these companies kept selling drug-laced tonics, morphine, and heroin legally, while traditional healers were getting fined, jailed, or run out of business for treating people with teas, oils, and prayers. They funded medical schools, research journals, and regulatory bodies like the AMA, or the American Medical Association, and the FDA. These companies created a system where only pharmaceutical-based treatments were considered legitimate. Herbalists and conjurers were excluded from insurance, hospitals, and former healthcare networks. Even today, most health insurance doesn't cover traditional practices like chiropractors, not because they're ineffective, they just know that there's not much to patent and sell. Not to mention, you might actually cure somebody and lose that lifelong clientele. Bayer marketed heroin as a cough suppressant and pain reliever for children. They were a part of IG Farben, which had direct ties to Nazi chemical warfare and the Holocaust labor camps. Now they're one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. Merck sold morphine, cocaine, and opium products openly and is now a major global player in vaccines, cancer drugs, and diabetes treatment. Eli Lilly distributed cocaine tablets, morphine, and later DES, which is a hormone linked to cancers and birth defects. Now a major pharma company known for Prozac. Park Davis and Upjohn both had long histories of selling opium-based tonics, cocaine elixirs, and morphine mixtures. Today known as Pfizer, and became a household name during the pandemic, and also sells Viagra, Lipitor, and much more. Johnson & Johnson produced opiate-laced cough drops and antiseptics, and was later linked to lawsuits over talcum powder containing asbestos and the opioid crisis. And that's just a few, and they're all still here, and they're even bigger. And many have scrubbed their history clean through rebranding, merging with other companies, and shifting towards biotech. However, their foundations were laid in a market that criminalized natural healers while profiting from addictive substances. Snake oil salesmen. Now in Sinners, Annie practiced the teachings of her grandmother, and Smoke believed it enough to keep that mojo bag around his neck for all that time. The information that she acquired through those years surely contained information about various threats of a physical and spiritual nature. I've seen a couple criticisms in my comment section about the fact that Annie knew about vampires. I think they may believe that vampirism should be out of scope for a hoodoo lady in the 1930s, but on the contrary, folk tales about the undead traveled through the states as early as the 1600s. Even before Bram Stoker's Dracula dropped in 1897, people in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, they started picking up bodies and burning the hearts out of them. They thought that they were performing rituals to stop vampires from draining the life of the living. So Annie could have definitely heard stories about vampires in 1932. And her being open to different schools of thought is why she would have come across that type of information in the first place. Now, I have to say, I appreciate the film not presenting the typical Hollywood trope of demonizing cultures that are misunderstood. Hollywood has long played a role in demonizing hoodoo, voodoo, and natural healing practices by portraying them as dark, dangerous, and evil. I mean, we got all kinds of examples from like the Skeleton Key to the Princess and the Frog. Hoodoo is shown as something to be feared, misunderstood, or used for sinister powers. Rarely are these practices shown in their true light as ancestral healing systems rooted in ancient knowledge, spiritual resistance, and community care. And these portrayals help to reinforce public fear and stigma, aligning perfectly with the goals of Western medicine to sideline non-corporate healing systems. They don't want your grandmother healing your fever. That's cutting into their bag. They want you to go run down there and get some Tylenols real quick and go sit on the couch. The witch doctor trope or the voodoo doll gimmick in the swamp shaman caricature, all that played a long-standing campaign to sever the people from their roots by associating their ancestor traditions with horror and devil worship. And meanwhile, those same studios that push these narratives often receive sponsorships or ad dollars from big pharmaceutical companies. Major networks and film studios are owned by these conglomerates with direct or indirect calls to these pharmaceutical giants as well. You got Comcast, NBC Universal, and its partnerships with health insurers and drug advertisers. Or you got Disney's ESPN airing commercials for Pfizer and Eli Lilly. You even get a dose directly in the show with product placements in medical dramas like Grey's Anatomy or House. And that helps to normalize the idea that only prescription drugs and hospital technology can solve illness. And it also dismisses holistic alternatives as quackery. This deliberate content pipeline ensures that audience absorb a one-sided view of health that uplifts chemical dependency and demonizes ancestral wisdom. Hollywood has become a well-lit stage where Big Pharma gets to write the script, direct the scenes, and erase the healers right out of the picture. And that's what we saw in Sinners. The truth about how the snake oil industry buried natural healing is also embedded in Hollywood's movies and TV shows just like this one. The #1 show on Apple TV at the time of this video is Severance, and it goes deep into the exploration of this history in the most subtle way that I've ever seen. I mean, they don't throw it right out there in your face, but just a little warning real quick, here's some spoilers if you haven't seen the show. The show is about a company that offers a procedure called severance where you can get a chip put in your head and separate your work life from your home life. This show is dope and I cover it on this channel. Anyway, the company that offers this is called Lumen, and it was started in the 1800s by a man who died in 1939. So this man would be alive during the time of the Smokestack twins. The company started off as a pharmaceutical company that produced skin salves. And I always thought that salves was an anagram for the word slaves. The company also owned ether factories and had turned poor white communities into ether addicts. systems. And remember when I said that the snake oil salesmen stole the rituals from the root workers? Get this, the workers in this company worship the founder like he was some sort of deity. They create voodoo/hoodoo style shrines for him and have herb offerings with animal parts just like African spiritual systems. They even wear all white, and this shows how the snake oil salesman stole ritual customs and adapted them to his own system of control inside of his company. This company is involved with political figures and owns media companies as well. Now, these aspects of the show are not really surface level. These are things that I've actually revealed in my coverage of the show. Come to think about it, the publication Vanity Fair recently published an article throwing shade at the film Sinners and the director. But get this TV show Severance that I'm telling you about, their director stepped up and spoke out against the magazine's article in their headline about Sinners. So I just thought that connection was so cool that this shows are pretty much pointing out the same thing happening in the same time period. Go check out Severance if you haven't seen it, and then come back here to watch my videos about it. Now, many people look at the hoodoo in the film and associate that with anti-Christianity, when the truth is that hoodoo practitioners and Christian pastors were both pillars in the community and often shared customs until churches were incentivized to make sermons about hoodoo being the devil's work. My grandmother's mother was an herbal healer, and her father was a Christian pastor. And while I was learning up under my grandmother, she would literally tell me about stories on how this happened. And at the time, what she described to me seemed like an actual culture shock for those communities. Some say that Christianity is a white man's religion given to blacks through slavery, and that's partially true. But Christianity is originally an African spiritual system, and Africans had the Bible long before Europeans in the King James Version. However, that Bible that was most dominant in America in its spiritual practice is nothing like early Christianity in Africa. Just like the practices of the natural healers, they stole Christianity, whitewashed it, and fed it to people for subjugation. So the origins of Christianity in Africa were nothing like what we see European settlers bringing to America and what most people in America subscribe to today. Early African Christianity embraced the indigenous beliefs. An Ethiopian Christian from, say, the 4th century to the 10th century wouldn't have called it voodoo, but they would have absolutely recognized the rhythms, cosmology, and the sacred technology within it. Ethiopia didn't erase indigenous beliefs the way colonized Christianity did. Christianity in Ethiopia evolved with African cosmology, not in opposition to it. Holy springs and sacred trees still venerated, use of incense, drums, chanting, and spiritual invocation rituals, priests wearing amulets and using holy soil. Exorcism, spirit communication, and ancestor remembrance were core elements of worship in Ethiopian Orthodox worldview. They likely saw African spiritual systems not as heresy, but as older ancestral expressions of divine contact. Christianity was originally diverse and deeply tied to indigenous African spiritualities. It became a tool of colonization to suppress traditional healing, wisdom, and spirituality. And by deeming natural healing as pagan or evil, European authorities leveraged their remixed Christianity to push indigenous healing underground, the same way hoodoo practitioners face criminalization in America, erasing the power and autonomy of the original practitioners in the communities. So there it is, part 3 of my Sinners series. Some education, a little bit of history and clarification. And if you like this video, go ahead and do all that dope YouTube stuff and tap that screen for me a few times. That's all for my video this evening. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.